My name is Nick Davies, and welcome to my talk on games animals play. I'm Professor of Behavioural Ecology at the University of Cambridge. In The Origin of Species, Darwin leaves us with a vision of the natural world as an entangled bank, where individuals compete to survive and reproduce in a competitive world full of predators and parasites and social competitors. In this talk, I want to explore some of the games animals play in this struggle to survive and reproduce. I'm going to look at mating games, where there's often conflicts of interest between the sexes. I'm going to look at evolutionary games between cuckoos and their hosts. And I'm going to look at games of safety, where individuals flock or shoal in a game against predators. And these games produce some of the most extraordinary outcomes. We can explore the rules by simple experiments and enjoy some of the real wonders of the natural world.
So, good evening and welcome to the 7th of the 2016 Darwin College lectures, which are exploring the theme of games. Last week we heard in a fascinating lecture from Barbara Sahakian how games can benefit the human mind whilst we enjoy ourselves. Humans are indeed good at games, but we could remember Marx's proof that animals can defeat Darwin. I'm talking about Harpo Marx, the dog catcher in the Marx Brothers film Horse Feathers. In that worst ever fictional sporting wipeout, the football match between Huxley College and Darwin College. So in that, Harpo used the superior speed of horses to defeat Darwin. They weren't really playing the game properly. But to turn to Charles Darwin, he presented a vision of a tangled bank, and he and Joseph Hooker even created one. They deliberately planted what has become a wonderful equatorial cloud forest on Ascension Island, then a barren volcanic island in the equatorial Atlantic. And they sent hundreds of plant species from around the world, but no animals were sent apart from feral sheep, donkeys, and miners. There is now this amazing cloud forest. In recent years, monarch butterflies have flown in from Africa, and it will be fascinating to watch how that entangled bank in Darwin's forest develops into the future. So tonight, the distinguished ecologist and 2015 Royal Society Croonian medalist, Nick Davies, who is Professor of Behavioural Ecology here in Cambridge, takes up Darwin's question of how the entangled bank evolves, where individuals struggle to survive and reproduce in a world of competitors, predators, and parasites. So please welcome Nick Davies to speak on games animals play.
Well, thank you, Master, very much for your kind introduction. And good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. It's such an honor to give this lecture. Now, for those of you who've been coming to the series so far, you might wonder what I'm going to talk about. Animals don't play legal or philosophical games, and they very rarely go cycling. But in the wider sense, games are played whenever the best thing for you to do depends on what everybody else does. So under this wider definition, of course, we've been playing games all our lives. We play social games. Our choice of friends and partners depends not only on whether we like them, but on whether they like us. We play economic games. How we choose to earn and spend our money depends on what others do. And even day-to-day decisions involve games. For example, which queue to join in traffic or in a supermarket, and what time to turn up to the lecture tonight and where you're going to sit. That depends on what everybody else decides to do. And we spend a lot of time worrying, checking where everybody else is and what they're doing before we choose what to do ourselves. Well, this little reed warbler might not look particularly worried in this beautiful photograph taken by Richard Nicholl last summer on Wicken Fen. Its chicks are backlit by the early morning sun, and it's bringing a little bunch of flies to feed its offspring. And at first sight, it seems as if it's got absolutely nothing to worry about at all. But this little bird, as all creatures, faces similar problems in a ruthless natural world full of competitors and enemies. Will it find enough food for this hungry brood? Has it chosen a nest that's safe from predators? Will its mate be faithful and help? Has its mate been faithful in the past? Are all those 4 chicks its own? These are all problems to face, and solving them will influence its success in the game of life. And the aim is very simple. It's to pass on more genes to future generations than your competitors. And for most creatures, this boils down to simply having more offspring than everybody else. And solving these decisions usually involves the best strategy depends on what everybody else is doing. Now, this naturally selected goal is so clear and so simple, it's often easier to analyze animal games than human games, because with humans, it's not so obvious what on earth we're trying to do. And I'm going to discuss 2 sorts of games: behavioural games, where individuals are making moment-to-moment decisions, adjusting their tactics in response to others, and evolutionary games, where the strategies change over the generations as new tricks evolve to beat old ones. And one of the stars of my talk is this little brown bird, the dunnock here. And here, as we'll see later, it's involved in an outrageous behavioural game to beat a sexual competitor. And yet it's losing out in an evolutionary game down here, being tricked by a cuckoo. And often you get this extraordinary mix, just as in human societies, of individuals doing brilliant things and being ridiculous too. Now, Darwin knew all about the outcome of natural selection producing the wonders of the natural world. An entangled bank with a struggle for life and, as a consequence, natural selection. And he ends The Origin of Species with this beautiful, elegiac picture of the natural world as an entangled bank with endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful evolving. And we'll see later in the talk that the games animals play do indeed produce great beauty. The exquisite markings on birds' eggs and the dances of bird flocks in the evening sky are both outcomes of games that animals play. But I want to begin with games involving competition for mates. Now, it used to be thought that the main problems faced by animals were simply finding sufficient resources and avoiding predators. And if you could do those 2 things, you'd have a happy life. But in the last 40 years or so, we've realized there are social problems too. And it's here that we can see how games lead to wonderful mixes of behavior as individuals try and outwit their rivals. So I introduce you to this marvelous newly discovered world of charmers and bullies and sneakers and cheats. We're going to go down to the pond in spring and we're going to watch natterjack toads. Now, male natterjack toads call loudly to attract mates, and you can hear the call from about a mile away. Just listen to this. And females approach these calling males, and they're just rolling down a sound gradient. So if you get 2 loudspeakers and put a female in between, she'll go to whichever is the loudest call. And the result is that the males have a shouting match to try and outshout their rivals and attract more females. Now, if you look carefully, you'll see that not all the males are calling. Some of the males adopt this quiet posture right next to a calling male, and they sit very still. If the caller detects this male, he'll chase him off, but often they can sneak up and they wait here undetected. And then when a female approaches, the satellite males jump on the female and try and intercept her before she gets to the caller. Now, if you collect the callers up and put them in a bucket, the satellites will immediately start calling. So they can certainly call, it's just they decide not to do so, and you might wonder why. Well, if you measure the satellites, you'll find that they're small males who've got weak voices. And they choose to sit next to males who've got much louder voices than themselves. And by intercepting some females on the way to more charming males, they do much better than if they tried to call themselves. So we have a behavioural game of charmers and cheats. And as satellites get older and get bigger, they switch tactics and become callers themselves. Now, in other cases, cheating is so specialized that it's programmed genetically. Individuals can't vary what they do. It's a tactic that's fixed throughout life. And here's a wonderful example with the ruff, a shorebird which you can watch in the fens in the spring. And the scientific name Philomarcus pugnax means love of fighting. And that describes very beautifully one of the genetic strategies shown on the left, where these males develop dark ruffs in the spring, and they're like lads on the town. They're full of testosterone. They strut about, defending little territories and trying to attract females. But there's a second type of male which doesn't behave in this way at all, and these males are satellites, and they've got white ruffs, rather like a flag of surrender. And they sneak matings on the edge of territories. Now, individual males can't change their plumage. These differences are genetic. So here in the top picture, we can see one of these territorial males very excited because a female's come along attracted to his territory. And the females are smaller and they don't have ruffs. You might think these two are females too, but they're not. This is the third male tactic, another genetic type. These are female mimics. This shows one of the costs of being a female mimic. Now, this not only fooled this territorial male, it fooled researchers too, because it's only in the last 10 years that this third male tactic has been discovered. Now, in the rough, we don't understand how these three male strategies remain in balance in the population. It must be a kind of frequency-dependent game. So if you imagine all the males are territorial, strutting about, then the payoffs for being a satellite male must be very high. But on the other hand, not everybody can be sneaks. So there's probably some balance maintained between territorials and those two sneaky types. We do understand how this balance is achieved in the third and final example I want to discuss, and that's the side-blotched lizard, so called because the lizards have got this little blotch on the side. And we're going out to California now, and again, there are three male genetic strategies. And these strategies have been likened to the paper, scissors, rock game, which we play as humans. So some of the males have got orange throats, this chap on the left here, and again, they're full of testosterone, they're very aggressive, and they try and guard a huge territory containing lots of females. There are other males on the right here which have yellow throats, and they mimic females, and they don't fight. Instead, they try and sneak matings. And then there's a third male type with a blue throat, shown in the middle here, and they're much more modest in their attempts, and they just guard one female. So you can think of the orange ones like paper, trying to cover a big area with lots of females, the yellows snipping away, sneaking females, and the blue ones like rock, solidly guarding just one female. And just as in our paper, scissors, rock game, the success of each strategy depends on what everybody else is doing. And a nice way to illustrate this is in this triangle. So the apex of each of these triangles represents a population where all the males play just one type. So on the left here, everybody is orange, paper. Over here, everybody is yellow, scissors. And up here, everybody is blue, rock. And in that space are represented just different proportions of the three male strategies. So let's start the game over here with everybody being orange. That's not stable, because in all this space here, yellow scissors-like males can make a profit. But we don't move all the way to a whole population of scissors, because in this population here, now rock males, blue males, do best, because they can guard one male faithfully and keep the scissors at bay. But again, we don't go all the way to blue males, because if everybody is modest in their aims and defending just one female like a rock, now more exuberant males who can try the paper strategy of defending more females do better, and so we start the game again. So in theory, with each male just doing one type, we could have cycles of the three male types going round and round this diagram here. And what's beautiful is that's exactly what has been seen in one little population in California over a decade, starting in 1990 and going through 10 years, subsequently. Cycles round and round, just as we predict from theory. So animals do go cycling. Now, when we play this rock, paper, scissors game, what we do is we play each strategy a third of the time at random. That's the stable thing to do. Then nobody can beat you. If you overplay one of the strategies, your opponent will pick up on that and play the best reply. If you don't play at random, they'll pick up on sequences and beat you. So the question is, why don't the lizards play the three strategies equally often and at random? And the answer surely is that lizards can't change tactics as easily as we can. We just change our hand gestures from there to there to there. The lizards are playing very different behaviors. They've got different physiology, different hormonal profiles, completely different behavior. It would be a bit like us playing the game where we have to fashion scissors from paper or rock from scissors and so on. You couldn't do that effectively. And so the result is it's an evolutionary game played over the generations rather than the behavioural game which we play by quickly changing hand shape. So the main message of this first bit of my talk is that in mating games the outcome is often a mix of strategies with charmers and bullies and sneaks, simply because once some competitors try and get mates by one method, that opens the approach for other males to exploit them. Now, Darwin knew all about mating games. He knew all about stags beating each other up to defend harems, although he didn't know about this rich diversity of tactics within a population. But mating games are only half the story. 100 years after Darwin, Jeff Parker realized that sexual competition often continues after mating. And that's because females often mate with more than one male, and as a result, their sperm compete inside the female tract for fertilization of her eggs. So now we're going to go to Africa, and we're going to enjoy some sperm competition games by comparing the mating behavior of gorillas and chimpanzees. Now, gorillas live in single male groups. One male will defend a harem of females, and he's done all the hard work by chasing off rivals, so he's pretty relaxed about his paternity, as you can see from his expression in the bottom right. Chimpanzees' life is very different. They live in multi-male groups, maybe 20 males all living together. It looks as if they're all doing a Morris dance here, but actually these males are doing a hand-grooming display. But their alliance is very uneasy because there's going to be fierce competition for mating within the group. Now, in chimps, females signal their receptivity by these sexual swellings. Here's a female here with an infant on her back, and this male is inspecting her, and he's very interested in mating. And during her fertile period, she'll mate on average 3 to 4 times an hour, and with many different males, often 6 or more, and commonly up to 30 in big groups. So there's a sperm lottery, where the more you mate, the better chances there are of getting a winning ticket. And this is a photograph you will never forget. This is the brain of a chimpanzee, and this is one testis. So evolution has equipped these animals to compete in the sperm lottery. And when Sandy Harcourt, some time ago, looked across all primate species, he found a very interesting trend. So we're plotting body weight across different primate species here, from little marmosets right up to big apes. And this is a log axis, so we're going across 10 to 100-fold span in body weight. And these are the weight of both testes, and as you might expect, bigger primates have bigger testes. But now if we divide these primates up into the sort of mating system they have, we see something very interesting. Those with solid circles here live in multi-male groups with lots of sperm competition. And here you can see that the testes lie above the line. They're much bigger than you'd expect. And again, this is a log scale, so this is a huge difference, with chimps up here as the champion. Primates which live in single male groups, so they've got control of a single female or a harem, are shown as open circles and open triangles, and they have much smaller testes than you'd expect. There's no need to mate so frequently. So chimpanzees are a third the weight of a gorilla, but they've got testes 4 times as large. Now, I know what you're all wondering, because we too, of course, bear the indelible stamp of evolution. So you might wonder, what were our recent ancestors up to? So for half of you, here you are, there, almost slap bang on the line. For the other half of you, here he is. As you suspected, he's just an average primate, not quite as relaxed about his paternity as a gorilla, perhaps, but thank goodness not so worried as a chimpanzee. Now, these mating games become all the more intriguing when there's sexual conflict, namely different best outcomes for males and females. Now, the theme of sexual conflict is, of course, familiar to all of us. It's inspired literature and art. And here's the Cambridge poet Edmund Spenser 400 years ago having a particularly bad day. My love is like to ice and I to fire. How comes it then that this her cold so great is not dissolved through my so hot desire, but harder grows the more I her entreat? Or how comes it then that my exceeding heat is not allayed by her heart-frozen cold, but that I burn much more in boiling sweat and feel my flames augmented manifold? Poor chap. Well, of course, biologists have experienced this angst just as much as poets, so we might wonder why biologists were so incredibly slow to realize that these conflicts see the way in animal societies too. In fact, it's only in the last 30 to 40 years that this has been studied. And the only explanation I can suggest is that we used to avoid anthropomorphism in studies of animal behavior. But wondering what you might do if you were a chimp or a gorilla or even a lizard can provide very valuable insights, because when you're weighing up costs and benefits in your brain to decide what's the best thing to do, that's exactly, of course, what natural selection is doing in the evolution of animal design across the generations. So here's a game of sexual conflict you can all enjoy this spring, even in your own back garden. We're going to the Botanic Garden now, and we're going to watch this little brown bird here called the dunnock, or the hedge sparrow. But I'm going to call it dunnock. Dun means brown, and ock signifies little, and it's the archetypal boring little brown bird. And in his History of British Birds, written in 1856, the Reverend Morris was so impressed with the dunnock and its modest appearance that he urged his parishioners to emulate its lifestyle. And this is what he wrote: unobtrusive, humble and homely in its habits, sober and unpretending in its dress, the dunnock exhibits a pattern which many of a higher grade might imitate, with advantage to themselves and benefit to others through an improved example. Now, as you'll see, that recommendation turns out to be very unfortunate. To see what's going on in these games, all you need to do is get up very early in the morning and put up these nets and catch the birds gently and put little colour rings on their legs so that you can follow them as individuals. And then we simply sit down and we watch what they do. We find all the nests. Dunnocks lay these beautiful blue eggs, and then we watch the chicks being fed and we score how well they do, and we put little rings on their legs too, and we follow their survival across the years. And we did that for 10 years, and this is what we found. In fact, dunnocks are just beginning to sing now. You listen out for them in the early mornings. Their song is a bit like that of a squeaky wheelbarrow. So on some territories, there's just one male defending the territory, and sometimes one male defends one female, and so the result is a monogamous pair. No doubt what the Reverend Morris had in mind for dunnocks. But sometimes males expand their territory to encompass a second female, so the result is polygyny. But next door to that, there might be two males sharing defense of a territory. Now, these aren't relatives, but one of them is dominant to the other, and we call him the alpha male, and the subordinate the beta. So they might defend one female, and the result is polyandry, or they might defend two neighboring females, and the result is polygynandry. Now, you might wonder if this sort of thing only goes on in Cambridge. But actually it goes on in Oxford too, and even in wilder places. So it's typical of dunnocks everywhere. So I want to focus on cases where two males are sharing a female. Well, the female alone builds the nest, and then about the time she's lined her nest, she begins to solicit matings. About a week before the first egg is laid, right up to the clutch is complete. She lays 1 egg a day, often a clutch of 4, so that's a period of 10 days of chaos, of mating games. And if you sit and watch, there's 3 things that are going on. First of all, the alpha male tries to guard the female and prevent the beta male from copulating. So here's the female busy feeding, forming reserves for eggs. Here's the alpha male on guard, and here's the beta male in the background. Now, the alpha male has a hell of a job keeping the beta male at bay because, of course, the beta male is very keen to come and mate. So the alpha male's continuously chasing him off. But what makes his life especially hard is that the female encourages matings from the beta male. In fact, she'll often fly off with both males in hot pursuit, and then she'll double back behind a bush and try and throw the alpha male's close attentions off and approach the beta male, and they might then hide away in the bushes, copulating like mad, and the alpha male's then flying around looking for them, and he might take many minutes, and in fact once 3 hours, to find them. So the males are involved in sperm competition, and just like the chimps, they've got especially large testes. In fact, the testes are 4% of the body weight. So just think of Michelangelo's David with footballs, and you'll be more or less on the right track. Now, as you can see here, the mating display of the dunnock is really rather weird. The male hops behind the female, and then he pecks her cloaca, and here he is, pecking away. And this mating display was first described by Edmund Selous over 100 years ago. And he was very worried about these wanton-looking pecks into the orifice, and he thought it was all rather lecherous. Well, if you look closely, during this pecking, the female's cloaca makes pumping movements, and occasionally there's a spasm, and during this spasm, she ejects a little droplet. And there's no doubt that this is what the male's mating for, because as soon as the droplet appears, he mates with a brief cloacal kiss, and that's the end of the display. Now, I spent a lot of time looking for these droplets, and one of them landed on a little leaf. And with great excitement, I cycled back up Tennis Court Road from the Botanic Garden to the department and put the droplet under a microscope, and it turns out to be a bundle of sperm. So what the male's doing is presumably he's trying to get the female to eject sperm from her cloaca, which might have been put there by the other male, to make a clear passage for his insemination. It's a good swap, because of course the sperm he's about to put in, he knows is his own. It is a problem working in the Botanic Garden, because often people come up and ask what on earth you're doing. And when I'm looking for sperm droplets, a truthful reply just seems so unlikely that I just pretend I'm doing a spot of weeding. Well, once the female begins incubation, that's the end of the game. The males stop chasing, and then the chicks hatch out, and you might wonder who's the father. So we use DNA profiling to work out who was the father of the chicks. And this is especially interesting in cases where both males mated. And here's 2 examples from these polyandrous trios. And this is the fingerprint of a female, the alpha male and the beta male, and their 3 chicks. And you can easily see whose side the chicks by looking at the inheritance of these bands. So here is a band unique to the alpha male, which crops up in all 3 chicks. And this band here in the alpha male confirms that he's the father. No band unique to the beta male, for example, this one, crops up in any of the 3 chicks. So there, the beta male was unlucky in the sperm lottery. Although he got a share of the matings, he lost the game 3-0. Over here, both males again mated, but the beta male did very well. So here's the female, the alpha male, and the beta male. Here is a band unique to the beta male, which crops up in the first 3 chicks. And other bands will confirm that he's the father. The poor old alpha male, here's a band unique to him, was the father of just one of the chicks. So a surprising away win, if you like, for the beta male, 3-1. And when you do this for lots and lots of broods, it turns out that where you get shared matings, on average, the alpha sires 60% of the chicks and the beta male 40%. And that's more or less what we predict from the mating share. Now, once the chicks hatch, you might wonder, can the males pick out their own sired chicks? And the answer is no, they can't. They just use mating success as an indirect cue. If the beta male fails to mate, he never helps. But if he gets a share of the matings, he'll always help, even if by chance he didn't get any paternity. And if paternity is shared, there's no tendency for males to pick out their own sired chicks. They just feed chicks at random. So why is there all this conflict? Well, once you look at the reproductive outcomes in the different mating systems, the games make complete sense. And I want to summarize what's going on. So here are 3 mating systems: polygyny, a male with 2 females; monogamy, a male with 1 female; and polyandry, 2 males with 1 female. And let's look at life from a female's point of view to start off with. Females are shown in red. Now, in polygyny, females don't do very well. On average, they raise 3.8 chicks per season. And the reason they don't do very well is that they only get part-time help from the male, because he's spending the other half of his time helping his other wife to raise her chicks. The female does much better in monogamy, where she has a male's full-time help all to herself. Then she can raise 5 chicks in the season. So no wonder these females are very aggressive to each other, and often the dominant female will try and chase the other one away to claim the male to herself. If there's a beta male around, females jump at the chance, because with the help of 2 males, provided they share the matings, they can now have more chicks raised, on average 6.7. So no wonder females are encouraging a second male to mate, because that boosts the amount of help that she can get with parental care. So females are pushing the mating system away from polygyny through monogamy to polyandry. But males are doing the exact reverse, because although more chicks are raised in total here, the cost to the male is of shared paternity. The alphas on average get 4 and the betas 2.7. And you can see an alpha would do much better to kick the beta male out altogether, change the mating system to monogamy, where he's got full paternity of 5 chicks. And in fact, the male does much better over here, because with a sum total of 2 females, he raises 7.6. So while the 2 females are squabbling, the male's hopping around in between to try and keep the peace. So why do we get a variable mating system in dunnocks? Well, the answer is very simple. Males and females do best in different mating arrangements. They're each pushing for different outcomes. And sometimes females get their best, and sometimes males get their best. So if you go to a polyandrous trio and you asked each partner what would they prefer, this is what they'd say. The beta males say, well, I'd like as much matings as I possibly can. The alpha males say, I'd like the whole lot, and that beta male just to shove off. And the female would say, I would like to split the matings 50-50, because it turns out that with that split, she would maximize the total male care to her brood. So those reproductive outcomes make beautiful sense of the conflicts we see in the game of mating. We interpret polygynandry as a stalemate to the game, in the sense that the alpha male can't chase the beta male off to get both females to himself, his best option, and neither female can chase the other one off and get both males to herself, which would be her best option. So you end up with a stale male to the conflict of 2 males sharing 2 females. Now, if small birds didn't have sufficient problems with their own mating games, there are also cheats at large. In a couple of months' time, we'll all be listening out for this wonderful call. Cuckoos arriving and heralding spring. But that call signals doom for many small birds, because, of course, the cuckoo is nature's most famous cheat. Aristotle knew this over 2,000 years ago. He wrote, "It lays its eggs in the nests of smaller birds. They do not bring up their own young." And here you can see the female cuckoo, having removed a host egg, laying her own in its place. This is actually a reed warbler nest. And there's the cuckoo egg, a beautiful match to the remaining 3 reed warbler eggs on the right. But for the poor old hosts, they're now sitting on a bomb set to explode in 11 days' time, and one which will destroy their clutch. And Aristotle knew this too when he wrote, "When the young bird is born, it casts out of the nest those with whom it has so far lived." But that brief commentary was forgotten for 2,000 years, and the credit for the first detailed description goes to Edward Jenner, the father of vaccination. And in 1788, he published a wonderful paper in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, whose full title then is shown on the top left, Philosophical Transactions, giving some account of the present undertakings, studies and labours of the ingenious in many considerable parts of the world. And Jenner's modest paper was entitled Observations on the Natural History of the Cuckoo. And it begins, "Dear Sir, having at your request employed some of my leisure hours in attending to the natural history of the cuckoo, I beg leave to lay before you the result of my observations. And after such a courteous beginning, what comes next is a shock. To my astonishment," wrote Jenner, just look at the top left picture, "I saw the young cuckoo so newly hatched in the act of turfing out the host young. The mode of accomplishing this was very curious. The little animal, with the assistance of its rump and wings, contrived to get the little chick upon its back, and making a lodgment for the burden by elevating its elbows, it clambered backwards with it up the side of the nest till it reached the top, where, resting for a moment, it threw off its load with a jerk. I afterwards put in an egg," wrote Jenner, "and this by a similar means was conveyed to the edge of the nest and thrown out." And Jenner pointed out that the young cuckoo has got a hollow back, nicely designed for the lodgement of eggs or host chicks to help it chuck them overboard. Well, Jenner's account was just disbelieved, and it's not surprising because even when you see it with your own eyes, you can hardly believe what's going on. If that wasn't sufficiently extraordinary, the host parent is often there watching its clutch being destroyed. So here's a female reed warbler sitting on the nest, and from below it is bursting a young cuckoo with one of the eggs balancing on its back. And just watch what happens next. So look at the female's expression and the egg and the cuckoo, because this is what happens next. One by one, she watches as her whole clutch gets tossed overboard, and any chicks too, and yet she does nothing to interfere. And here they are 17 days later. The cuckoo, having commanded the nest, has now grown to 7 times the mass of the little warbler that's feeding it, just as if it was a brood of its own chicks. So what we should have here, of course, is an evolutionary battle, an evolutionary game, where the hosts evolve defenses against cuckoos, for example, throwing out cuckoo eggs, and the cuckoos reply with better trickery, for example, with eggs which better match the host eggs. And so we should get a ding-dong battle across the generations, with hosts evolving better defenses and cuckoos evolving ever better trickery. Well, does this actually occur? And this is what stimulated some studies which my colleagues and I have done for the past 30 years on Wick and Fen, where the main host is the reed warbler. Now, on average, between 5 and 10% of reed warbler nests on Wick and Fen get parasitized by cuckoos. But interestingly, the reed warblers aren't fooled every time. In 20% of the occasions, they puncture the cuckoo egg and chuck it out of the nest. So what cues are they using to tell them that there's a cuckoo egg in the nest? Well, we decided the best way to test this was to make model eggs, paint them various colors, and become cuckoos ourselves, and pop them into host nests, and it's quite fun doing this, and then coming back the next day to see if the eggs have been accepted or rejected. And all our nest searching activities once attracted the attention of the police. And here's my colleague Mike Brooke being arrested under suspicion as an egg collector. And Mike's explaining to the policeman that he's not collecting eggs, rather he's putting extra eggs into birds' nests. And not surprisingly, the policeman's finding this very difficult to believe. Well, what we found was what you might expect. So if we put a model egg which is different in colour from the reed warbler's own eggs, most of those get thrown out, 70%. But if we painted our model eggs to look like the host eggs, only 3% got rejected. So it's no surprise, because hosts are so discriminating against odd eggs, that the cuckoos which parasitize reed warblers have evolved beautiful egg mimicry. See how good you are at spotting the cuckoo egg in the bottom photograph. It's actually this one. It's a little bit larger, but the match in colour and spotting is absolutely sensational. It's so sensational that the reed warblers can't tell just by looking at their clutch whether there's a cuckoo egg there. Often what they do is they look out for signs of adult cuckoo activity, and only if they see cuckoos on their territory or in the neighbourhood do they risk rejecting an egg. And the result is a game of hide and seek, where the cuckoos not only hide their eggs, but they also hide themselves. They're very secretive, and they're incredibly fast at laying. The female cuckoo will glide down, take out one reed warbler egg, lay her own in its place, and she's off, all within 10 seconds. And that speed is essential if she's to try to avoid alerting the hosts to increase egg rejection. Well, our experiments show that hosts in general tend to be very fussy about odd eggs in their nest. And for that reason, the common cuckoo has evolved into separate host races, each of which parasitize a different host species and lay an egg that tends to match the egg of their chosen host. So here are 4 examples. So this is a race of cuckoo that goes for great reed warblers who've got spotted eggs, and their cuckoos have come up with a beautiful match. If you go up to Scotland or to the West Country, cuckoos there go for meadow pipits, which have brown eggs, and that genetic race of cuckoos lays a brown egg. Again, a beautiful match. In the fens, the genetic race goes for reed warblers, and they've got green matching eggs. And our experiments show that these 3 hosts and others are very fussy, so no wonder their race of cuckoo has evolved a good match. The exception that proves the rule is the race of cuckoo that goes for the dunnock. The dunnock's got a pure blue egg, whereas the race of cuckoo that goes for dunnocks has got a grey spotted egg. And again, our experiments show the reason. It turns out dunnocks will accept any egg in their nest. So there's been no selection for their race of cuckoo to evolve mimicry. So we really do have an evolutionary game here, with evidence for this top arrow here that cuckoo egg trickery evolves only in response to host egg defense. Now, incidentally, cuckoos can do a beautiful blue egg. They do that for redstarts on the continent, where there's a cuckoo race that specialises on redstarts. They don't do blue for dunnocks simply because there's been no need. Now, what we want to know is, does this game go in both directions? Have host defences evolved specifically in response to cuckoo trickery? So wouldn't it be nice to go back in time and test redstarts before they ever became victimised by cuckoos, and the prediction might be that the situation would be like this? Well, we can't go back in time, but we can do something equivalent. There are some small birds which we can be pretty sure have never had an arms race with cuckoos. Because their diet is unsuitable, they feed their chicks on seeds, or because they nest in little holes to which the female cuckoo could get no access. And when you put your model eggs into the nests of these unsuitable species, it turns out they don't reject eggs. So it looks as if the baseline is for small birds simply to accept. Only in response to cuckoos do they evolve fussiness. So it's quite possible that the dunnock is at the start of the arms race, and it's yet to join the evolutionary game, if you like. Now, this isn't the end of the egg games. There's something even more wonderful going on, which has only been recently discovered. About the time Darwin was collecting finches on the Galapagos, John Clare, the poet, the peasant poet, was finding poems in the English countryside. And this is one of his most lovely poems, it's all about the yellowhammer's nest, and the yellowhammer's also known as the scribble lark on account of these extraordinary scribbles, just as if somebody had written on the eggshell. 5 eggs pen scribbled o'er with ink their shells, resembling writing scrawls, which fancy reads as nature's poesy and pastoral spells. Well, 80 years later, a biologist working in Africa suggested that this isn't just poetic whimsy, but birds really are signing their eggs with spots and squiggles. And the credit for this wonderful insight goes to Charles Swinnerton in 1918, and this is what he wrote. I doubt whether mimicry by the cuckoo would end the matter, for when the cuckoo's egg became indistinguishable, a perfect match, variation in the host's eggs would still afford a means of distinguishing them from the cuckoo's egg, and a race might have taken place between the host and the cuckoo eggs. So this brilliant suggestion is that the way the hosts write on their egg, "This is my egg," is in spots and squiggles. And the cuckoo then has to copy the same spots and squiggles in effect to write, "And so is this egg." So we get a game involving signatures and forgeries. Now, of course, we sign our possessions with signatures, and there the top 3 signatures are some famous naturalists. But if there are forgers at large, should you go in for something a bit more elaborate, these extra flourishes of Elizabeth I, or would even a simple signature like that of my little grandson do just as well? Well, the ideal signature should have 3 features. First of all, it should be replicable. And what that means is the female should sign her name exactly the same each time, just as she's done here. 3 successive eggs, all with the same markings. Secondly, the eggs should be distinct from other females, just like Darwin's signature was distinct from Wallace's, and this female of the same species of Warbler has got very distinct eggs, different signature from this one. And those 2 features are in fact typical of cuckoo hosts, much more typical than little birds that have never had an arms race with cuckoos. You might imagine that you should also be difficult to forge, and does that mean you have to make more and more spots and more squiggles? Well, it turns out that it isn't the more spots the better. The small bird with the best signatures in Europe is the brambling, which is a host to a cuckoo race in Finland. That's a much better signature, more individually distinct than that of the great reed warbler, which has more spots. And the reason is probably that it's not only the spotting, but the spacing between the spots and the squiggles that's important too. So by analogy, when you fly over the Lake District, you can easily identify the Langdale pikes, those distinctive peaks, not only because the peaks are distinctive, but by their spacing from the rest of the mountains. When you fly over a more complicated mountainscape, it's sometimes more difficult to know where you are. So perhaps little Leo might even beat Elizabeth in an arms race against forgers. Now, the prize for the most wonderful signatures of all go to a little African warbler called the Tawny flank prinia, studied by my colleague in zoology, Claire Spottiswoode. And these little warblers get clobbered by this cuckoo finch, which has got cuckoo-like habits. And here's Claire working in Zambia with 2 of the biggest smiles in Africa. These locals are absolutely brilliant at finding birds' nests. And this is why the Tawny flank prinia should get the prize. A female always lays the same egg. So this is a single egg taken from 8 females' nests, neighbours in the same field. And the variation in colour and spotting is absolutely astonishing. They have different background colours, they have different markings, and the marking dispersion varies too. So this has got squiggles, but they're across the middle. This has got squiggles, they're all down at the blunt end. This has got squiggles, but they're more dispersed. And the spot sizes vary too. And Claire has shown by swapping eggs between females that females are fantastically good at rejecting eggs which aren't their own. So to succeed, that cuckoo finch is going to need fantastic forgeries. And indeed it has. This beautiful photograph taken by Claire shows the array of signature types of the prinia, the little warbler around the edge, and the range of forgeries by the cuckoo finch here. Now, what the cuckoo finch should do, of course, is to know her own egg and choose those particular prinias for whom her forgery is going to be a good match. But Claire's observations show actually the prinias aren't that clever. They just lay at random, and as a result, there's often a bad match, and their eggs get chucked out. So this array of signature types is a fantastic defense by the hosts. And there's even one signature type on the left here, these olive eggs, which the cuckoo finch has not yet managed to forge. And Claire's observations have shown that in the last 30 to 40 years, this signature has increased in the population, presumably because females with those signatures are better able to detect a foreign egg. And it'll be really interesting to follow the game in future to see if this signature increases further, or indeed if the cuckoo finch can come up with a new forgery. Now here's an idea for a perfect experiment. What we should do is we should take these little warblers with complicated signatures, and we should release them on an island free from cuckoos. And we should track them over the generations, and the prediction is that their signatures would gradually fade because in a world without cuckoos, they would no longer be needed. And amazingly, this experiment has been done, though it began in shameful circumstances. At the peak of the slave trade in around about 1780s, slaves were taken from West Africa across the Atlantic to work in the West Indies in sugar plantations. And on board were some of these little weaver birds taken as pets. And these weaver birds are hosts to the Diederik cuckoo in West Africa. And just like Claire's prinias, they have tremendous diversity in their egg signatures to try and thwart the cuckoo, from white to blue, spotted, not spotted, big spots, small spots, and so on. Some of these weaver birds escaped on Hispaniola where there are no cuckoos, and so they've had 230 years free from cuckoo parasitism. And it's a cruel irony that this trip led to slavery for the African people, but freedom for these little birds. Now, David Lartey has measured the signature diversity in these cuckoo-free populations of weaver birds, and as predicted, there's less diversity than back in Africa. So it really looks as if there's been signature loss. Now, you might say this isn't perfect evidence because there's a more boring explanation, and that is that this is just the founder effect, namely a sampling problem. Perhaps on board there was only a subsample of the signatures available in Africa. But that seems unlikely for two reasons. First of all, the females in the West Indies have also got less consistency in their signatures. They're more sloppy in the way they sign their name on each egg. And there's another weaver bird population introduced more recently onto an island in the Indian Ocean, which has also lost signatures, but not so much. And that's exactly what you'd expect from more recent colonization. So it really does look as if signatures do indeed fade when released from cuckoo parasitism, but it just takes time. So we've got evidence that in this game, hosts evolve new signatures in response to cuckoos, but also lose them when parasitism fades. We've got time for one last game. So far we've seen that games animals play produce variable mating strategies, strange mixes of cruelty and beauty, and now I want to show how a game of safety in numbers with very simple rules can produce extraordinary outcomes. Here we have a peregrine attacking a bunch of starlings. Why are the starlings in a bunch like this? Well, out in the open, there's nowhere to hide. So they're safer in a flock. If you're on your own and a peregrine comes along, you're bound to be chosen as the victim. But if you join others, with a bit of luck, the peregrine will choose somebody else rather than you. Even if a flock's more conspicuous and attracts more attackers, you're still likely to be safer in a group. A flock of 1,000 isn't going to attract 1,000 more peregrines. And also, you're safer in the middle of the flock because hiding behind a barrier of companions gives you the best spot. So that's why you get lots of jostling for the best positions. And you see these fantastic movements of starling flocks, murmurations against the evening sky, where the flock seems to behave as if it was just one organism with these fantastic amoeboid movements across the skies. And when Edmund Selous had stopped worrying about dunnocks, he started worrying about these flocks and wondering whether there was thought transference in birds, or what, he wrote. Well, now we're beginning to understand this or what. And a pioneering study was done in the zoology department here by William Foster and John Treherne. And they were watching these little water skaters here being attacked by small fish, sardines. And what they noticed was as soon as the sardines began to attack, these little skaters jigged about and bumped into their neighbours, and a wave of panic spread through the swarm, so fast that the pond skaters on the other side of the swarm here already knew of the danger well before the sardines had started to attack them. And they call this the Trafalgar effect after the famous battle, where Nelson's fleet was waiting just over the horizon for the joint Spanish and French fleet to leave the port of Cadiz. And they knew that the opposition had already left the harbour before Nelson himself could see them, because the message was conveyed across a chain of flagships to get ready for battle. Now, we now know that these very simple local rules of just being influenced by your near neighbour can cause fantastic group effects. So here's a game you can all play on your computers when you go home tonight. You have a little fish, and it's just got 3 zones. It's got a zone of repulsion close by, simply so it avoids bumping into other fish. It's got a zone of orientation here, and in this zone, it orients in the same direction as its neighbour companion. And over here, it simply approaches, it's attracted to a neighbour. So you set all these fish in a swarm in your computer, and they'll all sort of mill around. Now all you need to do is just increase this zone of orientation, this zone B, just a little. And something amazing happens. All those fish in your computer suddenly start swimming around in a torus, a donut. Nobody's told them to do this. It's just an automatic result of them following neighbours' responses. And if you increase this zone B still further, now they all start swimming in one direction. If you add a predator with the rule that if you see a predator move away, you get waves of panic spreading through the swarm. If you tell some of your fish where the food is located, for example up here, so they start going off in that direction, all the others quickly start following them. Just local responses. Now, computer tracking of real fish has shown that it's a little bit more complicated than this, but not much more complicated. These simple local rules of being influenced by your neighbours and in turn influencing your neighbours can produce fantastic effects at the group level. So just look at these starlings being attacked by a peregrine. So I'll point the peregrine out as soon as I can see it. So these wonderful murmurations against the evening sky. So there's the peregrine. There it is. There's the peregrine. This is being played out every evening on Wick and Fen now. Go and stand on the Burwell Lode about 5 o'clock, and 5:45, they'll all plunge into the reed bed to roost. Fantastic. It looks as if there should be a conductor here, but there isn't. It's just local rules. And once the peregrines or the sparrowhawks disappear, the starlings begin to vote that it's time to go to roost, and little flocks will peel off to go down into the reed bed. If not sufficient follow, they'll all go back. But eventually enough vote that all is safe and it's time to go to bed. And it's just like getting a jug full of starlings and pouring them out of the night sky. They all drop into the roost to sleep. I began with Darwin. I want to end with Darwin's granddaughter, Gwen Ravarat. Gwen Ravarat is playing a game of croquet with her grandmother, Emma Darwin, on the lawn of Down House. And here she is in this beautiful drawing by Gwen Ravarat in her childhood memoir period piece. Gwen Ravarat never met her grandfather. Charles Darwin died 3 years before she was born, but Emma, Darwin's wife, was to live on for another decade or so. Gwen Ravarat was born and died in Cambridge, and here she is in a drawing she did of herself as an old lady being pushed around in a wheelchair by her nurse and her dog, Sancho, following faithfully behind. And her childhood home now forms part of Darwin College, the generous sponsors of these lectures for the last 30 years or so, and our generous hosts here tonight. You might be lucky enough to be sitting this evening next to somebody who knew Gwen Ravrat. If so, shake them by the hand, or better still, give them a warm hug. From you to them, to Gwen, to Emma, to Charles, that's just 4 handshakes or 4 warm hugs away from Charles Darwin himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for a truly marvellous lecture. The cuckoo reminds me somewhat of Don Giovanni, wonderful singing, heralding spring, but the cuckoo and his brood are, in human terms, evil, really as nature red in tooth and claw. Next week, for the final Darwin College lecture of this 2016 series, our speaker is the economist and Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling. He's a noted expert on bargaining, conflict, and cooperation, and he'll speak on the game theory of conflict. Next week, I will be in the States, where there the political game enthralls and at times appalls us. And so I will miss what promises to be another really memorable evening. But at Darwin, we're in good hands. Professor Willie Brown, my predecessor as Master of Darwin and a Master Economist, will chair the lecture. But thanks again to Nick Davies for a remarkable lecture tonight. Thank you very much indeed.